If you look at the gates of the splenic center, you're going to see that the gates run in a row through Libra into Scorpio. See 18 to 48 to 57, going all the way to the 44th gate. All of the 7 gates of the splenic system run in a row. And what's interesting about that is that all of those 7 gates are part of a house that's dominated by the 46th gate. The 46th gate is a gate of the cross of the vessel of love, and the 46th gate is the love of the body. And everything about what the splenic system is about the body. I was given a lot of information about various forms and the designs of various forms. And if you look at all the forms of life, if you look at plants, if you look at mammals, if you look at reptiles, if you look at fish or insects, wherever you look, all of them have a single awareness, and that single awareness is the splenic center. In other words, this is our oldest awareness system. And the whole thing about the awareness centers is to understand something very basic. Awareness, intelligence, is rooted in fear. Fear. All of this begins with fear. And the splenic center is uniform, it's universal in all life forms, because the splenic center is about dealing with the most basic fears, the fears of survival. Everything about the spleen is about its imperative to keep you alive. And it's something very important to understand about the splenic center. In other words, the moment that you're a bioform and the moment that you're vulnerable as a bioform, if you're a 3-year-old in the jungle, you're going to be somebody's lunch. And you're going to be somebody's lunch unless you're protected, unless you have a strategy, unless you have a way in which you can defend yourself. And everything about survival demands a certain level of intelligence. In other words, we think that dogs, domestic dogs, for example, and I've had them all my life, we have this assumption or this projection that they're particularly intelligent. But their intelligence is a reflection of what it takes to survive with a human. They've developed a strategy to be able to survive human beings. And it turned out to be a pretty good strategy. So the whole thing to start with is you start with the splenic center and you start with something very simple. That is, it's there to keep us alive, and keeping us alive is not a simple thing. It's a very complex thing. We have a problem in terms of what it is to be human. In terms of what it is to be human, at the moment that the young come into the world, they're not competent, and they're not going to be competent for a long time. They did feral children studies. A feral child is a wild child. And after the Second World War, during the Second World War, there were literally tens of thousands of feral children. Their parents had been killed in the bombings. They were running around on their own trying to survive in that kind of an environment. And what they discovered was that if the children were older than 7, they had a chance for survival. Under 7, their chances of survival were 1 in 70. In other words, it was highly limited. And there's something to understand about why we have the 7-year itch and why we have all of these things that are on this 7-year cycle, is that a child needs 7 years of nurturing before it has enough skills to defend itself and survive. So survival for human beings becomes very complex. Because we have very complex offspring, it means that we had to find ways to stay bonded, which is not natural. In other words, to stay bonded so that the offspring can be raised and nurtured so that it can finally go out there on its own and do what the genes want you to do, which is make more. All of this, by the way, is the genes wanting to make more. I mean, it just goes on and on. So this survival mechanism is something very complex. The other thing, when you look at the splenic center, the key to the splenic center is the 50th gate. The 50th gate. Now, the 50th gate is very special. It's special in the same way that the 6th gate, its mirror, is special. In the 6th gate is, through the 6th gate, all of the emotional waves of the solar plex system were initiated. Through the 50th gate, everything that we call intelligence is initiated. This is why it's the gate of the laws. This is why it's part of the defense circuit. It's why it's part of the defense circuit of nurturing. This is about nurturing the young. And you nurture the young with intelligence. I had a wonderful dog. and she was basically 3/4 wild. And she had a litter in the house. And one day when the pups were about 3 months old, she took all of them to the next door neighbor's chicken coop, broke into the coop, and showed her young how to look after themselves for dinner. My neighbor, by the way, was not impressed with that education. But nonetheless, it established my dog's intelligence. You know, take your kids, show them how to do it, right? Okay. So the whole thing about the 50th gate is it's there to provide intelligence in order to be able to find the right strategies for survival, staying alive. The other thing about the spleen is that the spleen operates existentially. In other words, it has a very, very limited frequency. Limited frequency. You know, when your spleen says to you yes or no, it's only yes or no for the millisecond in which it happens, because it's purely existential. And it's the most important thing about the spleen is that the spleen of all the awareness centers is the weakest. The weakest. When your spleen says to you no and you ignore it, it does not come back and say, hey, dummy, I just told you no. Your mind does that, not your spleen. Your spleen isn't going to come back and say to you, hey, I just told you we're going to have an accident. You know, pay attention. Doesn't do that. Doesn't do that. After you hit the tree, you say, I knew it. I just knew it, you know, but it's a little late. So the thing to recognize about the splenic center is that it's very, very important to us. It's essential for our survival, but it's very weak. It's very weak, and it never repeats a warning. Now, you see, the moment we went from being splenic like everything else to having a mind, our spleens took a beating. Because the mind is very busy rationalizing everything. You know, and the mind really doesn't appreciate the spleen, doesn't like the spleen. You know, the mind has its own trip, doesn't understand why the spleen says yes or no to anything, because the criteria is different. The spleen says yes or no to anything that is unhealthy. I'm a splenic ego manifester. My authority is in my spleen. Somebody comes up to me and asks me something, and I hear myself spontaneously say, go away. Now, I don't know why I'm saying go away. I have no idea, none whatsoever. What I do know is that in that moment, my spleen considers them to be unhealthy. Now, it doesn't mean they're going to be unhealthy 10 minutes later. Now, by the way, they don't know that. They usually just run away. But 10 minutes later, they could actually try again. They may get a totally different response. Because the spleen's like that. It's not a long-term protection system. It's moment by moment by moment by moment. And if you don't pay attention to it, oh boy, you really pay a price. Because it knows what is healthy for you or not in terms of your survival.